Move right into part two, where we're going to allow 15 minutes of interaction between the two presenters and the two presenters only. So, Pastor, I'll allow you to begin that process.
No, you can call me Jeff. I'm actually
okay.
I'm a pastor. Theologically, technically, I'm not. I'm in the Methodist Church, so just call me Jeff.
Okay, Jeff. Thank you.
You talk about Old Testament passages of prophecy about Israel can only be fulfilled by geopolitical, physical Israel. One of the areas I find with that, one of the difficult passages for premillennial dispensationalists, is Paul's use of Hosea in Romans 9, 25 and 26. Are you familiar with it?
Why don't you just quote it?
Romans 9, 25 and 26, speaking about the Gentiles being called by God, quotes Hosea. He says, 24 says, "Even us, whom he has also called, not from among Jews only, but also from Gentiles, as he also says in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be said in that place where it is said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God." In the Old Testament, those two quotations come from, I'm trying to remember if it's the English version of the LXX. I think it's 110 and 222 maybe, of Hosea. Those are two quotations from the book of Hosea. They're applied here to the Gentiles being called into the church. In Hosea, the prophecy in Hosea is about the restoration of Israel. And so here Paul takes a prophecy about the restoration of Israel and applies it to the church, to Gentiles coming into the church here in Romans 9. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I have a problem with saying that only geopolitical physical Israel can fulfill Old Testament prophecy. Here's an example of one place where Paul says, the Gentiles coming into the church was fulfillment of a Hosea prophecy about the restoration of Israel.
Well, as you well know, is that the question or comment? Or?
Well, it's kind of. You can go ahead and interact with that.
Okay. Well, as you well know, Romans chapters 9 through 11 deal with the relationship between Israel and the church, and this mystery, the church, which even the early the disciples didn't really understand till later point.
Thank you.
Is actually Paul really kind of clears it up here, because what Paul does is he says that the church, in fact, is a wild olive branch that has been grafted into the covenant blessings of Israel. That the church is receiving the fruit as a result of Israel's rejection of the Messiah. So when Israel rejected the Messiah, the church, the body of Gentiles and Jews, believing Gentiles and Jews, have been grafted into the covenant blessings of Israel. And they're receiving the sap of Israel, the blessings. Now, Paul makes the point, the whole point of chapters 11 is that you've been grafted into Israel. Israel hasn't been grafted into you. You've been grafted into Israel. Don't boast against the tree, because you too can be cut off. And then he goes on to make the point that Israel, at a future date, when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, will be restored to the position they had before.
So would you say that you can't use Israel? You can only use Israel to mean God's true people. Israel is unidefinitional. You can't have a.
Well,
different...
let's look at it this way. If you want to make Israel mean whatever you want, there's lots of groups out there, that are the new Israel. The Mormons, the Catholic Church, the British Israelitism. Everybody wants to be Israel. Okay, everybody wants to take Israel and they want to make it what they want to make it mean. Okay, when as you read through the Scripture, okay, God has very specific promises to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God has a covenant. In fact, if you ever look up the covenant, the Hebrew word for covenant is bereth, okay, which means to cut.
Yes.
And a great picture of what a covenant means is in Genesis chapter 15, which when Abraham cuts these animals and he places them side by side, and that at a few and as Abraham falls asleep and he sees a torch passing through the covenant, okay, what it really mean was the presence of God going between the two halves of the animal. What God was saying to Abraham, he said, in that day God established his covenant with Abraham. But the word covenant means to cut. And what that is if I was to make a covenant with you and we were to walk between these two animal halves, what I'm saying is that if I don't fulfill my covenant with you, may I be cut in half, okay? Well, that's what God was saying to Abraham. God was saying to Abraham, Abraham, I'm making certain promises to you. I'm promising you certain territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the great river Euphrates, okay? I'm promising you that your descendant, because that promise was continued to Isaac, and it was later continued to Jacob, because this covenant was continued as Moses brought the children of Israel. But it was God who was making that word bereth, that covenant. And God was saying that if I don't fulfill this covenant with you, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, may God be cut in half. Yeah. So that's how serious God takes his covenants.
It's interesting that, picking up on that, one of the things, the three major things that Abraham was promised in the covenant in 12, 15, 17, 22, and repeated to, of course, and those covenants were based on the creational mandate in Genesis 1. Interestingly, Paul, post-resurrection, looking back at when he's doing his little which is basically a commentary. Romans chapter 4 is basically a commentary on Genesis 15, 12, 15, and 17. When he looks back at that, in Romans 4:13, he says that not that Abraham was promised a land, but post-Christ, and understanding Christ as the fulfillment of the promises, that Abraham was promised that he would inherit the cosmos. One of the ideas in the Old Testament, and you see this in numerous places in the prophets, is that one day, and the same was true of the Garden of Eden, but the same is also true of the mountain that Jerusalem sits on, is that one day when God acts, it would fill the whole world. So that the localized blessing in the end times becomes an escalated blessing, which if the end times have happened, and that's one of the points I would make, is that in the scripture, Joel, you talked about Joel chapter 3. In Joel chapter 2, he talks about in the end times what's going to happen, and Peter quotes that specifically, saying this has happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus and the sending of the Spirit for the church. And so this idea that one day what's going to happen is this escalation of the promises in the end times is going to bring the escalation of the promises to Abraham. Paul in Romans chapter 4 doesn't say that the promise to Abraham was that he would inherit a little piece, but that he would inherit the entire cosmos. Another point on Israel, in Romans chapter 9 through 11, and I've written probably 3 major papers on it in seminary, on those, one on each chapter. Romans 9 through 11 is there because of Romans 10, 28, 29, and 30. God causes all things to work together to good to those who love the Lord, to those who are called according to his purpose. And then it goes on to that very controversial passage, for whom he foreknew, and that's Israel. Israel, you, O Israel, of all the nations have I foreknown, Old Testament scripture. For whom I foreknew, these I predestined, to become formed to the image of my Son, that he might be the firstborn of many brethren. And whom I predestined, these I called, and whom I called, these I also justified, and whom I justified, these I also glorified. And so Romans 9 comes up because Paul is saying that everybody that God has foreknown is going to become like Christ and be glorified. There's no loss. The whom that is foreknown is the whom that gets glorified. There's no change in membership through that whole thing. And so the question becomes, if Israel is God's chosen people whom he has known beforehand, whom he has foreknown, then why aren't they coming to Christ? And in Romans 9:6 he says, and here's where he uses Israel as 2 different definitions in the space of one verse. He says, not all Israel is Israel. That's the literal Greek translation. Not all Israel is Israel. And so the whole point of Romans 9 to 11 is not so much about the